The Council of Alien Species sat in their massive chamber, their eyes fixed on the holographic display in front of them. The images of Solara flickered above the table, showing her face a blend of two distinct species, her features marking her as different, a hybrid, something unnatural, they whispered among themselves. Some alien races were pure and ancient, others had evolved through millions of years. But Solara represented something new and dangerous, a mixture of two very different worlds. Her very existence threatened the delicate balance they had worked so hard to maintain. Solara was the product of a union between two species, the humans, a young and vibrant race, with a passion for exploration and creation, and the Xenorians, an ancient species known for their advanced intelligence and power. The union between these two had been forbidden, yet Solara was born against all odds. Her parents had defied the Council's edict, and the result was a child that embodied both the potential and danger of their rebellion. Her hybrid bloodline was a reminder to the Council that their control was not absolute. For years, the Council had observed Solara from afar. As she grew up on the isolated world of Xenora, her life had been one of quiet exile, living in the shadow of her parents' legacy. But as her powers began to develop, and her abilities grew stronger, the Council could no longer ignore her. She was a threat to their authority, a symbol of defiance against the established order. The decision to exile her was swift and merciless. They had no interest in her fate. They saw her as a mistake, one that had to be erased from existence, or at the very least cast into the deepest corners of space, where she could do no harm. The Council members agreed that Solara's survival was a matter of concern, but her potential had to be contained. They ordered her to be sent into the vast emptiness of space, far beyond the reach of any civilization. Her ship was equipped with just enough resources to survive a few months before it would drift into the cold void of the galaxy. On the day of her exile, Solara was escorted onto the ship by Council soldiers, their cold expressions matching the chill of the empty hallways she had once called home. They did not speak to her, nor did they offer any comfort. They were merely fulfilling their duty to eliminate a problem, a child born of defiance. She stood alone at the ship's hatch, staring out into the unknown, nothing but stars beyond, and the silence of the universe around her. The ship's engines roared to life, and she felt the vibrations beneath her feet as it ascended into the cold black sky. Her heart raced with fear and anger, but she had no choice but to endure this fate. The Council's decree was final and unyielding. Yet even as the ship sped away from her home, she could not silence the voice inside her that whispered she was not finished. She was more than they realized, and one day she would prove it. As the ship left the gravitational pull of the planet and entered deep space, the last of her supplies began to deplete. Solara knew she had only a few weeks to live unless something changed, but she refused to give up. The fire within her burned brighter than ever. The ship was her prison, but also her salvation. She would find a way to survive. She had to. And in the vast darkness of space, something was about to change, something that would shift the course of her life forever. Even Walker had always been drawn to the stars. It was in his blood to explore the unknown and push humanity's limits beyond the familiar boundaries of Earth. He had spent years training for this mission, a deep space exploration that would take him far beyond any human had ever ventured before. But nothing had prepared him for the moment he intercepted a strange distress signal in the cold vastness of space. It had started as a simple glitch, at first a series of broken transmissions that made little sense at all. But as the signal repeated over time, something about it stood out, something unmistakable. Even felt a strange pull toward it, as if the message was meant for him alone. Without hesitation, he adjusted his course, ignoring the protocols set by his commanding officers. He was a man of action and curiosity, and this was something he couldn't ignore. For days he followed the signal deeper into an uncharted region of space. He knew he was getting closer, but the signal's strength wavered, as if it was fading or being blocked by something larger and far more powerful each moment. He grew more anxious, not knowing what he would find, or whether the signal was even from a living being or a malfunctioning piece of technology. But as he drew closer to a small, drifting ship on the edge of the galaxy, Ethan felt a rising sense of urgency and determination. He docked his craft with the other ship and boarded cautiously, his breath slow and measured as he stepped into the vessel's dimly lit corridors. The place was eerily silent, the hum of the ship's failing systems barely audible in the background. He moved deeper into the vessel, every instinct telling him to turn back, yet the pull of the signal was undeniable. The ship had clearly been abandoned for some time. Its corridors were cold and lifeless, but something or someone was still alive aboard. As he reached the main cabin, Evan's eyes fell upon her. A figure hunched in the corner, her frail form barely visible against the shadows. She looked human at first glance, but there was something unusual about her features, the subtle yet undeniable alien qualities that made her stand out in a way he couldn't explain. He took a step closer and found her barely conscious, her body pale and weak, covered in rags as if she had been trapped in this forsaken ship for far too long. Her breath was shallow but steady. Evan knelt beside her, not knowing what to expect. The feeling an overwhelming need to help, her eyes fluttered open, locking onto his with a mixture of confusion and fear. He had never seen anything like it before. The alien blood in her veins was impossible to ignore, yet there was humanity in her gaze, a profound sadness and desperation. He spoke to her softly in a language she couldn't possibly understand, at least not at first, but his voice was calm and reassuring. "I'm here to help," he said, though he had no idea how he would be able to. She struggled to speak, her voice weak and strained, but she managed to form a few words. They left me." She paused, gasping for breath, her words cutting through the silence like a painful truth. Evan didn't need any more explanation. He carefully lifted her from the cold floor and placed her in a seat, activating the ship's life support systems. As he worked to stabilize her, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary rescue. This woman was not just an alien. She was something more than he had ever encountered before. Her presence felt like a question he had no answers for. As he watched her slowly recover, Evan couldn't help but wonder about the circumstances that had brought her to this point. She wasn't a prisoner of war or some lone explorer lost in space. She had been cast aside, abandoned in the vast emptiness of space, with no hope of survival. He had no idea who or what had left her there, but one thing was clear. Evan could never just turn his back on her now that their fates had intertwined. He knew his mission was no longer just about exploration. It was about saving her and uncovering the truth about why she had been exiled in the first place. And so began a journey that would lead them both into the heart of a galaxy on the brink of change. As Solara regained consciousness, the first thing she noticed was the warmth. The kind of warmth she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. The cold, sterile air of her ship had been replaced with something more human. Evan's voice reached her ears again, steady and calming, as though he had been speaking to her for hours. The world around her was blurry, but she could make out his silhouette leaning over her, his eyes filled with concern. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, her lips cracked, and her body ached in ways she couldn't explain. "Drink," Evan said gently, offering her a small vial of water. Her hand shook as she took it, but she managed to gulp down the liquid. It felt like life itself flowing back into her. Slowly, she allowed her eyes to focus, taking in her surroundings. The interior of his ship, unfamiliar but comforting in its simplicity. She was no longer trapped in the endless cold of space. She was somewhere safe. Evan remained by her side, watching her carefully. He had questions, so many questions, but he knew better than to rush her. Her gaze, now clearer, flicked toward him, as though she was still unsure whether he was real or just a figment of her deteriorating mind. Her face was still gaunt from starvation, and her hair, once long and flowing, was matted and tangled. Yet there was an undeniable strength in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in a long time among the people he'd known. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a rasp. It was the first time she'd spoken since their encounter. Her words came out halting, as if each one required immense effort. "My name is Evan Walker," he replied. "I'm an astronaut from Earth. I was on a mission, and I found you." His eyes softened. "You were stranded. I couldn't leave you there." A flicker of recognition crossed her face, though it seemed to vanish just as quickly. She looked away, staring out the window at the endless stretch of stars. Her past was a dark, distant place, a place she didn't want to return to. Her memories were fragmented, but she could recall the Council's decree, the cold betrayal, and the hopelessness that had come with being cast into space. She was no longer sure what kind of being she was, only that she was unwanted, exiled, and different. "I don't belong here," she whispered, her eyes dimming as she spoke. "They left me to die." Even shook his head, not wanting to hear it, but unable to ignore the weight of her words. The truth was that she did not belong where she had been, but it wasn't because of who she was. It was because of what she represented, something the ruling council feared. He could feel the weight of that fear in the way Solara carried herself, as if her very existence was a stain upon the purity of their universe. But Even knew better. She wasn't a mistake. She was a person, a being with thoughts and feelings, just like him. "You're not alone," Even said softly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "You're not going back to that place. I'm going to help you." Solara looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. In the silence that followed, Even's thoughts raced. The Council's power stretched across the galaxy, and if they found out that he had saved her, they would come for both of them, no questions asked. He couldn't imagine the consequences of defying them. Yet, as he looked into Solara's eyes, the choice became clear. He had no idea what she had been through, but he couldn't just leave her behind, not after everything she had endured. "Thank you," she said, her voice gaining strength, though the words were laced with uncertainty. "I don't know how you're going to help me, but I won't forget this." Even nodded, though deep down, he was unsure of how this would unfold. They were in uncharted territory, together. He didn't know who or what was hunting her, or why she had been abandoned in the first place. But he did know one thing. She was his responsibility now, and somehow he would protect her. In that moment, as Solara slowly closed her eyes again to rest, Even's mind was set. Whatever lay ahead, whatever forces stood between them, and the truth, he would face it head-on. There was no turning back. The stars outside the ship seemed to pulse with a new meaning. What had once been a routine mission now felt like the beginning of something far more important, something that could change the course of their lives and the galaxy forever. As the days passed, the bond between Even and Solara grew stronger. They spent hours talking, Solara slowly recovering, gaining strength while Even worked to understand more about the woman he had found and the dangers that surrounded her. She shared pieces of her story, though much of it remained fragmented, as if she were piecing together a puzzle she had long since given up on. She had been born of two worlds, rejected by both, and now cast into the vast emptiness of space with no one to turn to. Even had no answers for her, only his commitment to help, though he was beginning to realize how deep this situation ran. The more he learned, the more he understood that her exile wasn't simply about her survival. It was about something far bigger, something that could shake the foundations of the entire galaxy. The signal that had originally drawn him to her became an anchor, guiding them through the dark regions of space, away from known territories, and into uncharted, dangerous areas. Yet as much as he was committed to keeping her safe, Even couldn't shake the growing tension in the air. There was something out there, something that was following them, watching them from the shadows. It wasn't long before the first ship appeared on their radar. At first, it was just a blip, a faint signal in the vastness of space, easily dismissible, but then came more. The ships were numerous, all closing in on their location with alarming speed. Solara stiffened as she saw the growing numbers on the display. She didn't need to be told who it was. "The Council," she whispered, her voice betraying a mix of fear and resignation. "They found me." Even's eyes narrowed, his fingers quickly tapping commands into the console, trying to plot an evasive course. His training kicked in, but this was different. This wasn't just an exploration mission. This was real, and the stakes were much higher than he had anticipated. "Can you fight them?" Even asked, looking over at her. Solara hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the control panel. There was a flicker in her eyes, a brief flash of doubt, but also something more. A surge of power that Even hadn't seen before. He had witnessed her strange abilities during her recovery, moments where she manipulated the ship's systems without touching anything, where her body radiated a strange energy he didn't fully understand. But could she harness that power in a real confrontation? Could she stand against the Council's might? "I don't know," Solara admitted, her voice low. "But I won't let them take me again." Even felt a surge of determination rise in him. He couldn't let them take her either. They had already done enough. The Council's forces were relentless, powerful, and they were coming fast. There was no more time to run. The countdown to their arrival was short. Even couldn't outrun them, not with the limited capabilities of his ship. Instead, he made a decision. They would have to stand and fight. There was no turning back now. "I'm going to need your help," he said, his voice steady as he turned to face her. "We can't outrun them, but we can fight." Solara looked at him, eyes wide with fear, but also with something else, something that had been missing from her for so long. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for survival, a chance to escape the fate that had been sealed for her long ago. Together, they prepared for what was coming. Even focused on piloting the ship, maneuvering it into evasive positions, while Solara studied the systems around her, her powers slowly awakening as she reached out to the technology in ways Even had never imagined. She could feel the energy coursing through the ship, and with each passing second, she felt herself growing stronger. The fear in her chest began to fade, replaced by a fierce, unwavering resolve. The ships from the Council were closing in. It was time to make a stand. Even braced himself as he initiated the ship's weapons system, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Solara's mind raced, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the energy inside her build. She could feel it. Her power was growing, responding to her will, the technology around her becoming an extension of herself. It was time to take control, to show them that they had underestimated her. The Council's fleet arrived in full force, their ships encircling the small craft, a wall of metal and firepower. Even's heart raced as he maneuvered his ship into position, trying to stay one step ahead, while Solara prepared herself for the fight that would determine everything. The countdown had begun. The galaxy would soon know what happened when an exiled half-mutant dared to defy the will of those in power. The tension inside the ship was unbearable. The Council's fleet loomed ominously on the scanners, their ships forming a tight perimeter around Even and Solara's vessel. The hum of the engines filled the cockpit, the only sound as Evan's fingers danced over the controls. Sweat trickled down his forehead, but his focus never wavered. He had never been in a situation like this before, but there was no going back now. He had a responsibility to Solara, and there was no way he would let her fall into the hands of the Council. Solara, however, felt a calmness that surprised her. Her hand hovered over the ship's interface, her fingers twitching slightly as the systems seemed to pulse in response to her presence. It was like she could feel the ship, as if it were an extension of herself. Her power was growing stronger by the minute, and she could sense that it was only a matter of time before she would be ready to unleash everything she had. The Council had underestimated her. They had made a grave mistake. "I'm ready," Solara said, her voice steady, a sense of purpose behind the words. Her eyes met Evan's, and in them, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: unwavering strength, a resolve that wasn't born of fear, but of defiance. Even gave a tight nod, his grip firm on the controls. He initiated the ship's defensive maneuvers, weaving in and out of the approaching Council fleet, doing everything he could to avoid the incoming fire. The first volley of laser blasts rocketed past their ship, narrowly missing them, but the enemy wasn't going to stop. They were relentless. "Hold on," Even shouted as the ship lurched to the side, narrowly dodging another barrage of fire. The engines groaned under the strain, but Even kept pushing the ship to its limits. He could see the enemy closing in. There was nowhere to run. Even, let me help, Solara said, her voice calm yet filled with a quiet power. She reached out, her fingers grazing the control panels, and for a moment, Even felt the entire ship pulse with energy, as though it were alive. The lights flickered, and the ship's systems hummed in response to her touch. "What are you doing?" Even asked, surprised. "Something they won't expect," Solara answered. Her eyes locked on the Council's ships, narrowing in focus. She reached deeper, her mind extending to the ship's weapon system, her power flowing into it as if she were one with the machine. Even felt a surge of energy ripple through the cockpit, and then, without warning, the ship's weapon systems activated. The lasers on the ship's exterior flared to life, targeting the Council vessels with pinpoint accuracy. The first shot hit one of the enemy ships directly, causing an explosion of fire and debris. The force of the impact shook their ship, but Even didn't flinch. His eyes widened in shock, both at the destructive force Solara was able to wield and the way her power had fused with the ship's technology. "We've got them now," Solara said, her voice steady as her focus remained locked on the incoming threat. Her eyes glowed faintly, an ethereal energy radiating from her as the ship continued to fire at the approaching fleet. One by one, the Council ships fell back, their formations disrupted as Solara's attacks made their mark. It was clear that they hadn't anticipated her abilities, hadn't accounted for the sheer power she possessed. But even as they scored victories, Even knew they couldn't hold out forever. More ships were arriving, reinforcements closing in from all sides. They had the advantage. For now. But it was only a matter of time before the Council brought in more firepower. "Even, we need to go," Solara said urgently, breaking his focus. She could sense the pressure mounting. The Council would not let them escape without a fight. "We can't win this battle. Not like this." Even's heart pounded as he looked at the scanners. There were more ships arriving by the second. It was no longer just about survival. It was about getting away. He turned the ship toward an asteroid field on the far side of the system. It was their best chance for cover, but it would be a dangerous maneuver. The narrow corridors of the asteroid field would force the enemy to split their forces, but the risks were high. "Hold tight," Even said, his voice resolute as he initiated a full-speed course toward the asteroid field. The ship accelerated, the massive rocks looming ahead, their jagged edges sharp against the blackness of space. As they hurtled toward the field, Solara continued to manipulate the ship's systems, using her powers to enhance the engines and the ship's agility. The Council's fleet followed, but as they entered the asteroid field, their numbers began to thin. The field was a maze of rock and debris, difficult to navigate. Even weaved the ship expertly through the obstacles, his hands steady on the controls, his heart racing as he pushed the ship faster, deeper into the chaotic web of space. The Council ships struggled to keep up, some colliding with the rocks while others broke off to regroup. Solara, however, wasn't done. She reached out again, pulling more energy into the ship's weapon systems, making the ship's defensive capabilities stronger than ever. "I'm not running anymore," Solara whispered to herself. And as the Council forces scrambled to regain control, she made sure they would never forget the name of the half-mutant woman they had exiled. The asteroid field was their sanctuary for now, but Even knew it was only temporary. The Council's ships had been forced to slow down, but they weren't giving up. They were relentless, and their pursuit would not end so easily. Still, as the ship navigated through the dense maze of rock and debris, Even allowed himself a brief moment of relief. Solara's power had given them the upper hand. For now. But Even couldn't shake the feeling that something even darker was lurking just beyond their reach. "You're incredible," Even said, his voice filled with awe as he maneuvered around a massive asteroid that loomed ahead. "How did you?" He trailed off, unsure of how to finish the question. Solara's expression was unreadable, but the faint glow in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She was still tapping into the energy within her, the energy that seemed to come alive the more she used it. It was a part of her, something she could control, but also something that was dangerous if misused. She was pushing herself to the limit, and even could see it in the way her hands trembled slightly as they hovered over the controls. "I don't fully understand it," she said, her voice tinged with a quiet sadness. "It's something I've always had, but I was taught to suppress it. It's not just a gift. It's a curse, one I can't ever escape." Even frowned, glancing at her. "I don't see it as a curse." Solara's lips curled into a small, sad smile. "Maybe you don't, but you don't know what it's like to be hunted your whole life, to have people fear you for something you can't control." Even didn't know how to respond. He had no way of understanding what it had been like for her. But he could feel her pain, her exhaustion, and despite everything she had been through, she still fought, not just for her survival, but for something bigger. The rebellion that simmered within her was something Evan admired. She wasn't just a victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. The ship's sensors beeped loudly, breaking their quiet conversation. Evan's eyes snapped to the display, his heart sinking as he saw it. The Council had regrouped. Their ships were coming through the asteroid field, and they were closing in fast. "We don't have much time," Evan said, the urgency in his voice impossible to ignore. "We need to find a way out of here." Solara closed her eyes, drawing on the energy within her once again. She could feel the presence of the enemy ships, the pulsing of their engines, their desperation to capture or destroy them. But this time, it was different. She could sense something even more dangerous lurking in the depths of the asteroid field, something far more powerful than the Council's fleet, a presence that sent chills down her spine. "They're not alone," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's someone else who wants me." Evan's blood ran cold as he turned to her, his mind racing. "Who? What do you mean?" Solara shook her head, her eyes clouded with fear. "I don't know, but I can feel them. They're coming, and they're stronger than the Council." Before Evan could ask her to elaborate, the ship jolted violently, the sudden impact sending them both tumbling forward. The hull groaned, and a series of alarms blared as the ship's systems faltered. Evan's hands flew to the controls, but it was too late. The ship had taken a hit. One of the Council's ships had fired a direct shot, damaging the shields and causing a cascade failure in their systems. "Brace yourself," Evan shouted, desperately trying to regain control of the ship. The asteroid field was no longer a refuge. The Council's ships were closing in again, and now they had a new problem. The mysterious force Solara had sensed. Whatever it wasn't something they could face unprepared. "We're not going to make it," Solara said quietly, her voice full of grim realization. "They'll destroy us before we get out of here." Evan's heart pounded, his mind scrambling for a solution. But in that moment, something unexpected happened. The energy within Solara flared to life again, stronger than before. Her body shuddered with the force of it, and the ship's systems hummed to life, seemingly responding to her power. It was as if she had become the ship itself. "Hold on," Solara called out, her voice filled with newfound strength. The ship surged forward, a burst of energy propelling it with incredible speed through the asteroid field. The Council's ships, unable to keep up, scattered in all directions, trying to avoid the incoming barrage of asteroids, debris, and the overwhelming force Solara had unleashed. It was as if she had bent the laws of space itself to her will. "We've got a chance," Evan said, his voice thick with disbelief. "You did it." Solara's face remained focused, but there was a spark of something else in her eyes. Determination, but also something darker. The energy within her wasn't just saving them. It was growing, feeding off her fear and anger. She could feel it, and she knew it was only a matter of time before it consumed her. "I don't know how long I can keep this up," she said, her voice strained. "But for now, we've bought some time." Evan nodded, understanding the danger she faced. They couldn't run forever, and they couldn't outrun whatever was coming for them. But for now, They were alive, and that was enough. The ship tore through the asteroid field at breakneck speed, the debris around them swirling in a chaotic dance. Evan's grip tightened on the controls as the ship darted between massive rocks and shattered fragments. Solara's power radiated from her, enhancing the ship's propulsion systems and keeping them one step ahead of the Council's remaining fleet. But even as they escaped the immediate danger, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of the woods yet. The unknown force Solara had sensed was still out there, and it was closing in. "We're running out of options," Evan said, his voice tense. His eyes flicked to the radar, scanning for any signs of the Council or the new threat. "We can't keep this pace for much longer. We need a plan." Solara remained silent for a moment, her eyes distant, as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The hum of the ship's engines reverberated through the hull, but there was a strange stillness in the air. Her power was still pulsing, but it felt different now, more erratic. She was pushing herself further than she ever had before, and it was taking its toll. The energy inside her felt like a fire raging just beneath the surface, and she didn't know how long she could control it. "There's no way to outrun them forever," Solara said finally, her voice steady but laced with concern. "But I know of a place, a hidden system, far off the Council's radar. It's a long shot, but it's the only place I can think of where we might find refuge." Evan glanced at her, his eyes narrowing in thought. "A hidden system. How do you know about it?" Solara's gaze flicked to him, her expression hard to read. "I've been running from them for a long time, Evan. I've learned things, seen things most people never will. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to regroup, to figure out our next move." Evan didn't ask any more questions. He trusted her, more than he had trusted anyone in a long time. Her resilience, her determination, were all he needed to know that she wasn't just someone who had been cast aside by the galaxy. She was someone who could stand against it. And maybe, just maybe, together they could fight back. He made the decision. "Set the course," he said, his voice resolute. "We're going there, whatever it takes." Solara nodded, her fingers moving over the controls with practiced ease. As she began inputting the coordinates, the energy inside her flared again, more intensely than before. She winced, a sharp breath escaping her lips, but she forced herself to push through. She couldn't afford to falter now. They had no other options. The ship lurched as the engines powered up, and the stars outside began to blur as they prepared for a jump into hyperspace. But just as the ship was about to initiate the jump, the unthinkable happened. A new presence, something powerful, alien, ripped through the fabric of space, appearing in front of them with terrifying speed. Evan's eyes widened in shock as the ship's sensors blared a warning. The force was unlike anything he had ever encountered. No ship, no human technology, could match the raw power of what was coming. Solara's entire body stiffened, her breath catching in her throat as she felt it too. "They're here," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her gaze locked on the rapidly approaching ship that materialized out of the void in front of them. It wasn't a council ship. It was far more advanced, sleek and menacing, its black hull reflecting the distant stars. The vessel seemed to hum with a life of its own, its energy signature far beyond anything they had ever seen. And there in the cockpit was a figure, tall, imposing, cloaked in shadows. It was no ordinary pilot. This being, whoever or whatever it was, radiated an aura of command, of dominance. The voice that suddenly filled the ship's comm system was cold, devoid of any emotion. "You cannot hide from me, Solara. You cannot escape your fate." Solara's heart froze. She had heard that voice before, during her darkest moments, in the silence of space, in the places where she had been hunted. This was not a council officer or a mere soldier. This was something far more dangerous, something far more personal. "Who are you?" Evan demanded, his hand instinctively going to the ship's weapon systems. "What do you want with her?" The figure's voice echoed once more, his tone dripping with disdain. "She is mine. She always has been. And now, she will return to me. Silara's eyes flashed with a mixture of fury and fear. No, she whispered, shaking her head. Not again. I won't go back. Avon felt a wave of terror wash over him. He had no idea who or what this figure was, but it was clear that Silara's past was catching up to her in the worst possible way. They couldn't escape. Not like this. Not now. We can fight, Avon said, his voice determined, even as the gravity of the situation pressed in around them. We have to. Whatever this is, we're not giving up. Silara met his gaze, her eyes hardening with resolve. The energy inside her flared again, a powerful, almost destructive force. We're not giving up, she said, her voice stronger than ever. But we're going to need more than just a fight. We're going to need to face what's coming. Together. And as the enemy ship closed in, ready to strike, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. Silara had come a long way, but her greatest challenge was only just beginning. The tension in the cockpit was unbearable as the enemy ship drew closer. Avon's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the controls, his mind racing for any kind of strategy. The massive, sleek vessel before them seemed to distort the very space around it, as though it were a force of nature rather than a machine. Whoever or whatever was piloting it, they were not just a threat to Silara, they were a threat to everything. And Avon couldn't let that happen. We can't outrun it, Avon muttered, glancing at the redouts. The enemy ship had positioned itself in front of them, cutting off any potential escape routes. We need to fight. Silara, her eyes glowing faintly with the immense power that coursed through her, didn't answer at first. She was still processing the voice, the very presence of the being that had made its intentions clear. I've never wanted this, she whispered, her voice laced with pain. But I can't run anymore. I won't let it control me. Avon glanced at her, his expression softening. He had seen the scars on her spirit, the weight of the burden she carried. But he also saw the warrior within her, the fighter that had refused to succumb to the horrors of her past. We're in this together, he said firmly. I don't care what they think they own. You're not going back to them. Not on my watch. Silara took a deep breath, her hand steadier now as she prepared herself for what was to come. The energy within her surged again, but this time it wasn't just raw power. There was purpose behind it. She had been afraid of this power for so long, but now she understood it. It was her choice. She could wield it. She could fight with it. And she would. Her fingers danced over the controls, not just as a pilot, but as a force of nature herself. The ship's systems hummed in response, as though recognizing her power and amplifying it. With a burst of speed, she propelled the ship toward the enemy vessel, her energy infusing with the ship's weapon systems. The first volley of lasers she fired felt almost effortless, blindingly fast and devastatingly accurate. The enemy ship shuddered as the blasts hit, but it didn't slow. Instead, it retaliated with its own barrage of fire. The cockpit jolted, alarms screaming as Avon did his best to keep them steady. He could see the damage on the hull, could feel the vibrations from each impact. But the ship was still functional. They were still alive. This won't be enough, Silara muttered, her voice cold with determination. We need to disable their power core. If we don't, they'll just keep coming. Avon nodded, his mind working quickly. We need to get close enough to board, to hit their weak point. Think you can get us in close? Silara's eyes narrowed as she scanned the enemy ship. I can do more than that. I'll tear through their shields. Just keep us steady. Avon didn't question her. He had seen her power in action, and now he trusted her completely. Let's do it. With a swift motion, Silara reached out again, her mind pushing through the ship's systems, weaving her energy into the enemy's shield defenses. Avon saw it. First, a flicker, then a full disruption in their energy shield. The ship ahead of them faltered, its defensive barrier weakening as it tried to regain control. Without wasting a second, Avon steered the ship directly into the breach, racing toward the enemy's hull. The ship rattled as it tore through the last of the remaining shield, and with a violent jolt, the ship crashed into the enemy's outer shell. The impact was so powerful that it sent a shockwave through their ship, but they were inside now. Inside the heart of the enemy vessel. The enemy ship's power core was right ahead, surrounded by thick, reinforced walls. Solara's energy flowed into the ship's systems again, and with a violent explosion, the power core imploded in a spectacular display of light and sound. The shockwave sent both ships spiraling into the vacuum of space, but they were far enough away now to avoid the worst of the damage. Evan's heart pounded as he checked the status of their ship. "We did it. We're..." But before he could finish, the voice came again, colder this time, more menacing. "You think you've won. You're only delaying the inevitable." Evan turned, his stomach sinking as he saw Solara's face twist in recognition. "It's him," she said, her voice tinged with a mixture of fear and fury. "The one who controls my fate. He's not done yet." From the wreckage of the enemy ship, the figure that had taunted them began to materialize, surrounded by an aura of energy that was almost beyond comprehension. He stepped into view, cloaked in darkness, his form taller and more imposing than ever. His eyes, glowing with a malicious light, locked onto Solara. "This ends now," the figure intoned. "You belong to me, and I will make you remember." But Solara didn't flinch. She had come too far. She had fought too hard. And now, with Evan by her side, she would face her past. The battle for her future wasn't over. It had only just begun. With a deep breath, Solara stood tall, ready to fight once more. This time, she would not back down. This time, she would win.